There you go. Well, good evening to you, Stuart Sinclair Weeks. Okay, well, I'll just come to your room so you don't have to sit up, but Calvin out here, but I'll see you when you get here. All right. Yeah, Calvin, Stuart's be here in about 3 minutes. He's running a little bit behind.
Okay.
Oh, General Bray, I see you join us. How are you, sir?
I am here alive and well.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it.
So did I hear you say that we were on a bit of a pause?
Yeah, about 3 minutes or so. 3 to 5 minutes, yes. 3 to 5 minutes. Yes. Oh, just to let you know, we've had about 75 people have watched the little video that we did with you guys last week, just to let you know that. So people are paying attention to what we're doing. Oh, excuse me.
How is this going to go today?
Well, I'm probably no more than 30 minutes. This is just a shorty. I think it's just to readdress some of the issues about the December 6th, but Stuart has some updates, so I would think no more than 30 minutes or so, General Bray. Is that good with your schedule?
Oh, we're good. I've blocked an hour.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, we got the time. If we want to, we can. If you have content, I always love content, so I can make myself available. We can have a wider audience than just us.
Well, is this going to be? I guess the question I'm going to ask is, what's the order, and what's the central question we're going to explore?
Well, we got two different things going on. Stuart Sinclair Weeks asked that we have this meeting. He's still trying to get a little more clarity about the impact of Juneteenth and the impact of December 6th. There have been several emails that I've invited you to participate with. We're having kind of a wider discussion now because, as you may or may not know, this group that I've included you with, originally they were addressing the Declaration of Independence and an amendment. They had planned to do an amendment to the Declaration of Independence that would be printed and distributed here in Concord on July the 4th. But I was asked to, submit that to differing groups of my own. And so if I'm going to be in charge of distributing the question I want to know is, well, how, if at all, are we going to address the 13th Amendment? And so that's one of the questions that we added to the email that I sent out to you guys a couple of days ago. And now we've had some replies back that, yes, in fact, we do need to understand that the Juneteenth, even though it's popular, because of so many people in so many states been working for it for so long, but it's popular, but it's not, in my opinion, it's just not as relevant as December 6th. So that's kind of where we are, General Bray, right now.
Perfect.
Do you know that there are 22 states who do not recognize Juneteenth as a federal holiday?
And they're the ones that probably are on two sides of the fence and used it as a weapon for the other one without trying to. But to be fair, there are moments when I said,
I can bring this in your own, if you like. Yeah.
Why, when you know better,
Mm-hmm.
you're supposed to do better.
Right.
And so when I have a difficult time celebrating Juneteenth, other than almost in my mind, I see it as I'm going to somebody else's house who's Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
and I celebrate Christmas, but I'll do Hanukkah because it's okay. It doesn't affect me, but it's not relevant.
This meeting is being recorded.
Wait, I just wanted to let you know that, again, I always take full advantage of every opportunity I have. So we're recording and we're streaming, just to let you know, because, again, this is one of those situations, General Bray, where unless we address the problem that we have, again, 6 corporations that own 90% of the world's media, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get another narrative out there. So I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is Andrew Williams Jr., and technically, this is another conversation with Andrew Williams Jr. I've been asked to host this on the part of the Center for American Studies in Concord, but I'm here with 2 of my favorite people, Mr. Calvin Pearson out of Hampton, Virginia, and also General Arnold Gordon Bray. And the topic is the topic of interest. We are now June the 12th of 2023. And one of the topics that is close to mind is Juneteenth, which many people may or may not know is a federal holiday here in the United States. Well, General Bray, I also want to say that Juneteenth this year will have a wider footprint, at least in my network, because I have a team in Nigeria, Lagos, Nigeria, that will be celebrating Juneteenth. We have speakers from South Africa, from Canada, from the United States, including Lady Alicia Hamilton and others that you may know. So yes, we want to take this opportunity to take Juneteenth global and have the conversation about what this means, not just to American history, but to world history, which is why, again, this is so important. So Stuart Sinclair Weeks, thanks for joining us. We're live and living color. Can you imagine that, Stuart?
I see it.
If I may, this is, first of all, thank you. For 2 reasons. One is that an opportunity to educate, inform those who don't know and those who are trying to find out more. First of all, if you ask most people when was slavery ended, they'll say it ended with the Civil War. They'll say that. Then if you tell, and then those who were familiar with Juneteenth, they would say, well, that's the day that it really officially ended because of Texas. And there's a second tier understanding or misinformation. There were 2 significant, and I'm gonna try to keep this crisp and chime in if I get too winded. But there are two things that people forgot or misinformed about. In 1863, January, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln. It was designed to free the slaves in the Confederate-held states for two purposes. One is at a core level, he had described that the single greatest state right that the states were looking for was slavery. And it was the thing that was going to break this union. And so he passed the executive order that freed slaves, and it freed slaves in the Confederacy. What was missing is an understanding by most that all the states that had slaves didn't join the Confederacy. As a matter of fact, West Virginia, who held slaves, just was not going to leave the Union. Missouri never left the Union. Kentucky never left the Union. Maryland and Delaware never left the Union. Those were the toughest states on slaves as well, by the way, because they were trying to hold them. Now, but the Emancipation Proclamation had the twofold purpose of freeing slaves, creating disruption, and at the same time creating allies in the South as well from the slaves. Juneteenth was Texas' rebellious attitude that did not accept this and enforced it with a strong hand. But in 1865, General Gordon came into Houston and freed the slaves after the war had ended in 1865, because the slaves in Texas didn't know that they had been declared free. And so we celebrated over the years Juneteenth, June 19th, and they were just called Juneteenth, as a celebration. And it became a big deal in Texas. And like many things in Texas, we all celebrate and party. You know, we learned how to do a lot of dances because the Texas brought them to us. But the problem is that noise that was made by that delay of 2 years to freedom, and because it was after the Civil War, it seemed like the ringing of the bell. But the reality is most of us did learn in history that the slavery ended with the 13th Amendment. We heard that. We all knew that. But we never really put the dates together. And that's where the misinformation, that's where the two breakdowns came. And some people thought it was because the war was over and Texas was just late to the game, but it was 2 years after emancipation that Juneteenth occurred. But more importantly, slavery was not over in the United States, even though the war had ended. But in January of 1865, Lincoln, in his infinite wisdom, what he had done was he was carefully making sure the war didn't end without slavery being officially abolished. And so he passed the 13th Amendment through both houses in January.
Okay.
But now when you have the war ended, you brought back in the other Confederate states. So now you have to ratify the Constitution. And it took 3/5. We know that. So it was not until Georgia, the 27th of 35 states, signed the 13th Amendment that we had the end of slavery, December 6th. So back to my comment earlier, once I really recognized that slavery is not over, I have a problem with celebrating December 6th, because even though I'm from South Carolina, it kind of makes it official for where we were, but for the rest of the country, it did not. There were 250,000 slaves that were still in bondage when the war ended.
Right.
And so we now should actually, and to your opening salvo,
Yes.
those foreign countries, those other members of the diaspora who look to the United States as the shining city on the hill, they absolutely should not be saluting or celebrating Juneteenth. They should be the proponents for what we really did give the world, which is an end to chattel slavery, end to black slavery, with the 13th Amendment on December 6th. And that should be a date that we in this world, this people of color, all those who are part of the diaspora, we should celebrate that as Freedom Day.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's when it matters. And oh, by the way, there's a guy named Carl Mack and we even got a way to make that celebration more official. That ought to be the day that we celebrate that thing that also gave us the real spinoffs of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which is the real grasp, the real step forward to financial literacy and freedom. And that ought to be the date that we celebrate, making sure that we support those black businesses. We should encourage all those in the world to support the black businesses on that day. And that's how we make it more of a celebration day. And that ought to be the day that everybody ought to have stamped on their foreheads, because it is that day that it really ends. Because the Emancipation Proclamation, by definition, honestly, there was no authority in those seceding states to free the slaves at that time. So anyhow, I stop.
Well,
Arnold, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I apologize to you both that I was a bit delayed, and also for the confusion with the prior call. I value both of your time very much, and I'm sorry for these slight inconveniences. But to what you've just said, I just want to get clarity on this issue. And thus I wanted to ask Calvin if he would respond, because once we're clear, the Center for American Studies is prepared to put all of our weight behind what you're speaking of. For a very simple reason. Dr. King said, and I knew 3 of his 4 children, he said, unearned suffering is redemptive. And I believe it is my black brothers and sisters who've grasped these words of Dr. King that have kept the show on the road, that have kept the holy flame of the heart burning in this land, when folks like myself from comfortable established backgrounds, going back to the very beginning, we've just been asleep with this American dream. I think it's this redemptive impulse that was brought by my black brothers and sisters that have kept the show on the road. So I long, I can say, to put all of our weight behind these matters. We need to be clear once we're on the same page. And so may I ask Calvin if you would respond to what Arnold has said?
Well, it sounds like I'm going to be the minority in this discussion.
That won't be the first time in your life, will it, Calvin?
Yeah. When I look at December 6th ratification, to me, it's a piece of paper, just like the Constitution, Bill of Rights. It's just a piece of paper. It has no enforcement. It had no action in it. It's just a piece of paper. That's why I support Juneteenth, because Juneteenth is only symbolic of the end of slavery, because we know there were 250,000 people still held in bondage in Texas. We know that people are still held in bondage in Oklahoma. And so it's symbolic. People don't recognize, right now we have all these problems with the Constitution and everything else. A lot of people just don't recognize December 6th. Now, when you really get into the nuts and bolts of some of the things that were stated, Abraham Lincoln, he stated that I do not want to free any African. I do not want to free any slaves. And he says the only way I'll free the slaves is to save the Union.
That's correct.
When he found out he was losing the war, and that the colored troops or those held in bondage wanted to fight for the Union, his generals and everybody else says, let's free the Africans, free those held in bondage so they can fight for us. And that's the only reason why Abraham Lincoln freed anybody. I live here in Hampton, Virginia, a city that was held by Confederate troops. The first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation was read here in Hampton on January 3rd, 1865. Although we were being held in the Confederate territory, when the people held in bondage heard the word, "You're free," they took that to mean they were free. And the crazy thing about it was that nobody fought them. The plantation owners let them go because they heard the word free. A lot of those people held in bondage just walked off the plantation because the Emancipation Proclamation said they were free. But the thing about it is that Abraham Lincoln had no authority to free anybody in a Confederate state. It was, again, a piece of paper that had no enforcement, had no meaning.
Calvin, can I step in for just for a second? There's two things that I think you just missaid, but
Okay.
you missed. It was 1863 that the Emancipation Proclamation was read.
Yeah, you're right.
And there was 250,000 slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation and until December 6th that were in the states of Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware that were still enslaved after Juneteenth until No Kidding the Country recognized that slavery had ended 6 months after the Civil War had ended as well.
Yeah, you're correct. I was misspeak.
Yes, okay.
I misspoke on the date, but you and I are correct on the date.
Okay.
One of the things people don't realize about Juneteenth is that on May 25th, 1865, 200,000 colored troops left Virginia heading for Galveston, Texas, because they were told that there were still people in bondage. They arrived in Galveston, Texas on June the 18th. They then got word to Colonel Granger that, yeah, you need to come to Galveston because these people are still held in bondage. We also found out that Granger didn't write the article too that he read. He had one of his subordinates write the article, and Granger only read it when he got there. So there's a lot of misconceptions and misinformation about the actual date of Juneteenth. So a lot of people thought that the white troops went to Galveston and freed all the people held in bondage. And now we've got the actual facts, we've got the ship log, we've got the dates that they departed, the dates that they arrived. 20,000 colored troops came to Galveston and walked down the docks at the amazement of those people held in bondage who had never seen a black man or a colored man in an army uniform. So there's so many stories out there. So that's why my opinion is that I support June 19th, because it was a date of action. It was not just a piece of paper. It was a date of action that actually freed people and that led to the eventual freedom of 250,000 people in Texas and eventually in Oklahoma. So the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation, we tell people that Juneteenth did not end slavery. We don't want people to keep saying that Juneteenth ended slavery. We want them to know that those colored troops marched all the way through North Texas into Oklahoma, and they eventually freed the people that were still held in bondage. So we say that in 1866 in Oklahoma was the last date that we know where there were still people held in bondage. So again, as I told y'all before, there's 22 states that haven't even recognized Juneteenth as a national holiday. Most of them say that we can't afford another state holiday, another federal holiday. And that was the main reason why a lot of states have not recognized Juneteenth, because of money. So there's two sides to the story. Hopefully, when I speak, I can tell people the true story about Juneteenth.
Calvin, thank you. In minority or majority, what I'd like to do, if you both are willing, you and Arnold are willing, is just to have you converse back and forth so that we can come to a consensus, if that's possible, looking ahead to the gathering in Concord. So, Arnold, may I ask your responses to what Calvin has said?
Yeah, I have no problem with his articulation that he liked to celebrate Juneteenth as a date of action because he sees some enforcement, some level of follow-up enforcement. Because the reality is that the slaves themselves, once it was read the document, and by the way, I lived on Fort Monroe, 3 blocks from where the first slaves landed in 1619 as part of a bartering. So I lived there for over 9 years, on and off.
Wow.
In the first house that was actually shared the same house that Ridgewood lived in for a while. But anyhow, so I've got that. And there's some other pieces we can talk about later on, whereby there were Black troops that were involved in conflict and made some significant inroads and started to, because see, June 19th to me is only relevant to the 2 things that Calvin mentioned. One is that it was a day of action to enforce, and because he's highlighting the fact that there were 20,000 African American troops that were part of General Gordon's movement into Galveston, Houston, and then up into the other areas. But it doesn't negate that the fact that they didn't have the power of congressional influence, which means that they didn't have the power of all of our nation's forces to enforce the end of slavery. I mean, if you think about it, those slaves that existed in places like Arkansas, when they went up into Missouri, they could still be put back in bondage until December 6th, legally, until December 6th. And if a person wanted to try to use the economic engine, or even the worse, the inhumanity of slavery for whatever purposes they had, in those 5 states inside the United States, they could do that. Because it was it. So if you talk about the actions of those abolitionists in those places that wanted slavery to be discontinued, they didn't get the authority to go ahead and enforce what they believed. The legal system could not enforce what we had already determined in the Constitution 409 years ago, 9 years earlier. We were not able to enforce. So it was an enforcement document. It became a legally enforced document when Georgia signed as the 27th state to ratify the Constitution, because and by the way, I concur in the public statements of Abraham Lincoln regarding slavery. But having been to Gettysburg and seen a lot of his personal writings, there are 2 Lincolns.
Yeah.
There's the public Lincoln
Yeah.
that's out there. There is the private Lincoln, and then there was the spiritual Lincoln that you have to make sure you understand. You separate those people, because one was in fact all about preserving the Union. But if you want to know about him freeing the slaves, candidly, the movie Lincoln is not a documentary, but there are excerpts in there where you can see, based upon the history, that he manipulated the end of the war and the signing of what took place at Appomattox until he could get the 13th Amendment passed. He wanted to make sure he did not bring the Confederacy in until he got Congress to pass the 13th Amendment. And he used Senator Stevens, who was an avid abolitionist, to work some of his seniority and magic to make it work. So if you go about 2 or 3 levels deeper into the politics of what happened, the enforcement of the document was there. I mean, and again, there is no disconnect between what Calvin says about Juneteenth, other than the fact that Juneteenth is not an American holiday. It's a black slave, it's a Southern black slave holiday, but not a United States in truth. Other than the fact it was a tool that was used, and so we can celebrate it because if the idea of the African American soldiers as United States soldiers is impactful, then I have no objection. But in terms of a United States document, Juneteenth was actually an illegal document, not illegal. It was an unenforceable document if the Confederacy would have won, because only Lincoln never called the Confederate soldiers non-American. In fact, he was adamant about making sure that his leaders always called the Confederate soldiers Americans. He was adamant about that because that was his premise, is that this was a blood in, blood out affair. We could not sustain ourselves as a divided nation, and those that thought they could break away from this nation had no place to do that. And that's why he was able to go ahead and call it vital, meaning he was willing to shed the blood that he did, the most in our history for the Union. And so, Calvin, again, I don't disagree with the idea that it is a different level. But again, if I'm a Missouri-born person, a Kentucky-born African American, a West Virginia, Maryland, or Delaware, when Juneteenth ended and everybody was celebrating, me and 200 of my closest and shackled friends were still in bondage for another 6 months after those other colored troops came in.
Yeah, I understand your point. But see, you said Juneteenth is not really a federal holiday. It's really a...
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say it should be federal. I said it's not a fully American holiday because it is because of the past.
Yeah.
But the reality is that if you were in the States for the next 5 months,
yeah,
after the celebration of Juneteenth in Texas and Oklahoma or the other southern states, there was still 5 states where slavery was still legal in the United States, where those same people that if they were freed had been sold in those 5 states, they would still be in bondage.
And that's why I keep saying June 19th is symbolic. It was not the end. There were people still held in bondage. But people can make the same argument about July 4th being a federal holiday. After July 4th, I mean, people were held in bondage for another 89 years. People think that Independence Day meant freedom for African Americans and people held in bondage, and it did not. That's why you got a lot of people today who do not support or celebrate the 4th of July. So my position right now is that I can support both Juneteenth and December 6th. I mean, I don't think I need to choose one or the other. I'm in a position where I can support both. I mean, I support the legislation for changing the Constitution, and I support Juneteenth. So, I mean, a person can support both.
Sure. But I'm so glad that we're at least having this conversation because it's important to understand the difference between symbolic and federal law.
Yeah.
And it is, in fact, I think, critical, General Bray, that we do engage this conversation. What do you think, Stuart?
I am very grateful to be listening to people who know a lot more of the subject than I do. I think if we can come to, and it sounds like we're pretty close to a meeting of the minds and hearts, this is a major step. And the Center for American Studies will do all we can to support Calvin and Arnold, your work.
Thank you. Well, let me briefly do a station identification here, if I may, because not only, again, are we talking about Juneteenth in the United States, and we're not only talking about Juneteenth right here in Concord, Massachusetts, nor in Galveston, Texas, but we're actually talking about Juneteenth being celebrated for the first time on the continent of Africa through the World Humanitarian Organization for Peace and Equity. And I'm proud to be the chairperson of their International Advisory Board. But this is not the first year we've done this. We actually got started back in 2020, and we were celebrating an entire week of May 25th through May 30th, which is Africa Liberation Day. Many of the people on this flyer have been with us for at least those last 3 years, because truly what we're understanding is that there are not just blacks and whites in America that are impacted by Juneteenth or these other celebrations. Right now, there are over 1 million people here that of African descent that were born in Africa that are now a part of our daily life and our daily society. And to the extent that we are able to engage them while they're here, but also engage them on the continent, General Bray, I think this is where I see a pathway for us to connect together the African Continental Free Trade Area and the trillions of dollars available through purchasing power in the United States, African Americans, with those on the continent. So I'm looking beyond just symbolic relationships. I think it's important that we bring forward the fact that 55 African countries have all dedicated themselves for a 50-year plan that could include involvement with us in the diaspora, only as soon as we are the ones step up to connect that dot, General Bray. So I think you've had experience throughout the world in Africa, and I like your viewpoint on these thoughts.
Yeah. First of all, I and again, this is if I can try to cut the baby between what we have just talked and be a little more succinct. I like, in fact, I take it as I like the fact what Calvin said is that there's a Juneteenth represents an action of African Americans to follow up and enforce an executive order or an executive decree in 1865 after the Civil War had ended, operating under that executive order. But I think at the international level, the legislative, executive, and law of the land is more applicable to the rest of the world. Because Juneteenth was only in the Confederate parts, but because the United States is it is really the shining city on the hill for democracies, in spite of our failings, to recognize that we are, as Dr. King called it, we are a world's great experiment. And I would ask anybody to really look at the monogamous relationship of faith, language, or faiths, languages, tribes within other nations, and look at the tossed salad that we are trying to create. And I don't call it a melting pot, it's a tossed salad, because we want everybody to maintain their identity. So when you look inside, you can see all of me. And we try to make it exist in a coherent fashion. And so when we pass the law, that law then carries with it the enforcement, not just capability, but the enforcement requirements of local and federal laws, federal requirements. So it is enforceable. And with that stated, I think that's the part that we really share with the world, because that means the will of the people, not just the president, the will of the people is then executed in the 35th Amendment. Now, that said, the 13th Amendment, but that said, as soon as the 13th was done, people were trying to find loopholes to put us back in bondage.
Oh, yeah.
And so we had to have a 14th. It's only a paragraph.
Right.
To the 14th Amendment. Then to get rid of that country where you were born in. Then we had to have the 15th Amendment. Then ultimately, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which, by the way, is still being ratified in the year 2022 and 23.
Correct.
Because it was written simple, but that document, that 13th, that's the one that begins the process of really trying to bring forth the creed that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator. That's what we're trying to make real. And that's what we really share with the others. And while I enjoy the celebrations, I think it's important that we understand that the reality is it's the constitutional demand which represents the will of the people and their representatives.
Right. Well, I think it's, before we leave, it's only right that we take time to actually read what it is that we've been talking about. So I'm going to read the 13th Amendment. What's that in your hands, General Bray?
I carry the Constitution with me and have been doing this for most of my military career, and I keep it inside my backpack. and I read the Declaration of Independence every month.
Okay.
Every month. With the sole purpose of making sure that when I hear someone throw out something, and if we got time, I'll even give you my take on this most misquoted, misused, misunderstood thing called the Second Amendment. And I will do that if you want to do that in a few minutes. And I'll tell you why it's important for people to read it, and don't let somebody else tell you what it says. Because it's like, it's one of the beauties of, I'm Catholic, but it's one of the beauties of the Islamic faith. People wonder why they all have to read Arabic, because first of all, Muhammad wasn't illiterate. But what he did was he made it that every follower, as you evolve, you have to read the words yourself so that you understand. And Christ did that for us in the same way. That's why he allowed certain parts to be exposed. And everything we need to know, you'll figure it out. And other people will try to frame it for us in a different way. And these guys weren't so bad. It's just that, bad people sometimes do bad things to good people. And I'll stop there. I'm going too far. Otherwise, I'll start wanting to get into a pulpit.
No worries. Well, you carry the pulpit with you wherever you are, but that's another story altogether. So, and please, Stuart Sinclair Weeks, be ready to address that first opening stanza of the Declaration of Independence. If we're going to get into this, we may as well get into it. But the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the abolition of slavery, 1865, passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and ratified on December 6th, 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. So it says. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation declaring all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforth, and forever free. Nonetheless, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the nation, since it only applied to areas of the Confederacy currently in a state of rebellion, and not even to the loyal border states that remained in the Union. Lincoln recognized that the Emancipation Proclamation would have to be followed by a constitutional amendment in order to guarantee the abolishment of slavery. The 13th Amendment was passed at the end of the Civil War, before the Southern states had been restored to the Union, and should have easily passed in Congress. However, though the Senate passed it in April 1864, the House initially did not. At that point, Lincoln took an active role to ensure passage through Congress. He insisted that passage of the 13th Amendment be added to the Republican Party platform for the upcoming 1864 presidential election. His efforts met with success when the House passed the bill in January 1865 with a vote of 119 to 56. On February 1st, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln approved the joint resolution of Congress submitting the proposed amendment to the state legislatures. The necessary number of states, 3/4, ratified it by December 6, 1865. In conclusion, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides that, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. With the adoption of the 13th Amendment, the United States found a final constitutional solution to the issue of slavery. The 13th Amendment, along with the 14th and 15th, is one of the trio of civil rights amendments that greatly expanded the civil rights of Americans. So that is, yes, sir. Go right ahead, General Bray.
I just want everybody to understand that he gave a lot of words.
Yes.
But the actual amendment is these simple words: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Part 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. That's the entire 13th Amendment.
Okay.
And so I want to make sure you understand how clear that was designed. And that second part was that, it became enforceable at that point. Up until that point in time, it was not.
Calvin, care to comment?
Well, the general has made a lot of key points. He's a very learned person. He's right about Juneteenth being a American type of celebration, etc. It's not celebrated or recognized in Europe and other nations. It's an American so-called unofficial holiday in many states. He made some good points. The question I had was, if you're trying to amend the 13th Amendment, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's a great comment. Yeah, this is the challenge when you do what they did. They thought it was a simple matter, and they wrote it in simple words. But because you've got evil who's trying to work it. And as a matter of fact, that's part of the criminal justice system was used, especially in the South, to do the same thing. Especially a lot of them, they would put blacks in jail, and since you were convicted the jury couldn't have black folks on the jury, so you're putting blacks black enslaved. That's why some argue that the judicial system was another form of slavery. I really kind of disagree, but I understood how it got there. So I think the 13th Amendment, as it is written, is correct. I think what needs to happen is some of those folks who are scholars need to really go through and find out what are the loopholes. Don't try to just keep going after, don't keep chasing the pieces. Go after what the people who are creating the loopholes are going after, and then recraft an amendment to address the loopholes. Because what we keep doing is we keep trying to plug the dam.
Right.
That makes sense. And we keep going after, well, it missed this, and we need to look at the holistic issue that we're trying to, because it all goes back to the Constitution. We are trying to affirm that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if we start saying what are those things we must do to ensure that the pathway from the time you take your first breath, you're protected and given the opportunity to rise to your own level of incompetency or competency, that's what we need to address, and that every person has that right. Because if we keep chasing the sub-issues, we're going to have a problem. So I guess I'm saying in simple terms, the 13th Amendment was crafted correctly to get to what they're trying to go after. But evil people were looking for loopholes to assert their supremacy and to repress those who they saw as different.
Right.
And so we're chasing the wrong thing. We shouldn't be chasing the amendment. We should be chasing the dream. And amending our Constitution to enforce and inform the vision.
But when we look at the 13th Amendment, we know our prison systems have used that to force people into hard labor. And there are a lot of people questioning, why do prisons have the right to force inmates to work? I've always thought that the Constitution was not written for us. We never had the inalienable rights. The Constitution was written for white people, because when the Constitution was written, they looked upon us as property. They looked upon us as servants. There's nothing in that Constitution about us. All men are not created equal in their eyes. And they've proven that.
Actually, Calvin, actually, some of the key crafters of it were very conscious of that, and so there was some appeasement that took place, because there was a Rutledge, a gentleman named Rutledge from South Carolina, my home state. He wanted them to specifically say all white men, but there were others who specifically said, I can't do that because I know that not to be true. Now, it might be Sally might have been influencing Jefferson in some ways that you and I can never fully understand, but he couldn't do it. He wouldn't write that because it was actually pushed for him to do that. And just like other people coming up, we have ideas, we have perceptions and prejudices that existed. But the reality is, it was really a visionary document that transcended the days. And the things that we're talking about, like the prison systems, those are precisely what evil has been trying to do to that document. They were looking for the loopholes, because this is where King really talked about the voting rights. That's why the 15th Amendment had to come into place in the first place, because until we start leveraging the vote to recraft the laws so that the laws will ensure the capabilities of people of color are at the place of business. until you're at the table of all tables, you're going to stay on the menu. Because even though there are three separate and co-equal parts of our government, the executives at the local, state, and federal levels set the table for businesses, set the table for the law enforcement, set the table for all of the people who really create the laws and really enforce the laws. Because that was why there was the urgency of now that Martin Luther King Jr. put on LBJ, because he gave him a daggum dissertation to explain to him why the Voting Rights Acts were so important. But by the way, that goes back to 1866, because there were evil people that saw that let's don't worry about what the writing says on the law. We will determine how that law is implemented.
Interpret it.
That's interpreted. That's correct. Interpret it and implement it. We'll do that. That's how they do that. So what has to happen is we've got to leverage the pieces that drive those documents. We've got to put ourselves in places and leverage the good men to the point that, you remember that there's always been people who have put their lives on the line when they don't have to. We're cornered. We got to fight or flee. But there are others who are also on the other side. And by the way, lastly, before I'm gonna stop for as long as I can anyway. But July 4th, Frederick Douglass gave his dissertation for why he celebrates July 5th. Because it was the day after, in his mind, that he was waiting to see the United States really live out its creed. And so he says that he did a speech called the July 5th speech, which I thought is excellent if you've never heard it before. So anyhow,
I'll look for that specifically.
Well, I just wanted to,
Calvin.
I just wanted to add, when we go back to the Constitution, it would have been politically incorrect for them to say white men. But we know in the back of their minds who they were writing this Constitution for. I saw a documentary that was taped right after the Civil War. And they asked the plantation owner who had owned all these slaves, he says, and they asked him, well, what did you think about your slaves before they were freed? He said, well, the slaves were superior pets. You don't let pets vote. He put them in the same category as his cows. And that was the thinking of a lot of people during the construction and writing of the Constitution. They didn't see us as human beings. They did not see us as people. They saw us as property. And that's what we remain for another 89 years.
Well, as we wrap this up, Stuart Sinclair Weeks, go right ahead.
Calvin, would you say that applied to Washington, to Jefferson, to Madison, to Franklin?
Well, all of them owned slaves. So
would you say that they and this brings in the relationship, which I think Arnold may interest you, between Phyllis Wheatley and George Washington, and she actually ordained him as Generalissimo, commander of the Continental troops, and she gave him his marching orders. So do you feel, Calvin, that's what Franklin and Jefferson, Washington, and Madison felt, that their slaves were just, pets?
Well, we know if you studied Benjamin Franklin, we knew he was an abolitionist, that he wanted to end slavery. He wrote a lot of articles. He even started a school in Philadelphia for black kids. He was one of the minority people who opposed slavery. But when I talk to people, I tell them that slavery was legal. that these presidents owned slaves because it was legal. There were also black people in America that owned slaves. So that's a different conversation. So do you fault a person for doing something that's legal, which was legalized owning of people?
What I hear you saying, Calvin, is that one, you acknowledge that it is hard to measure what was in there necessarily in their heart versus leveraging the authorities that were granted by the law. And I typed into the conversation, just so you know, the Confederate States actually wrote their Constitution almost exactly like the United States Constitution, except they were very clear. They wrote that all white men were created equal. And so it reflects that. And then the other piece I was trying to get out is that their people may have had their own prejudices. In 1752, based upon the writings of Jefferson, he had questions whether or not the African was capable of the higher levels of learning, but Benjamin Banneker helped change his mind when he gave him an almanac that to this day still is accurate, and his other designs. So some of that was sort of like learning who your new neighbors are, you know, and there was, you know, and Ben Franklin was surrounded by Quakers, so he knew it was wrong, and he was evolving.
Right, he was.
He was evolving, and as many were, because remember that sometimes we confuse. A lot of them were confusing the absence of understanding of the language with aptitude and intellect. One of my favorite lines comes from a movie called Scarface, when he comes in and kills this guy who had been talking around him the whole time and disrespected him the whole time in English, and he told him as he killed him, just because I speak with an accent doesn't mean I think with an accent. So some of that was at play. Some of that prejudice was at play, especially if your whole world was based upon this idea that you are British and you're from an aristocracy. And if you're a person like Ben Franklin and some of the other ones that were in this country who were trying to be on the ascendancy of an aristocracy, which is why George Washington was adamant that we would not have kings here, because at this core, by the way, I bore anybody that talks about kings and queens, because if you buy into that, that means you buy into the fact that people are born better than you.
Yeah.
So that's the core of who we are. And so in that definition, I have to believe that many of them who, just as you said, Calvin, followed the law were learning to adjust to thinking that they had not been brought up with in their lives.
Well, I would suggest that people go out and read the history of Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederate States of America. He writes his true feelings about how he felt about slaves.
Yeah.
He had a disdain for slaves, and I think that he was one of the people who probably helped write that Constitution for the Confederacy. So he was a terrible man when you start reading about what he said about those who were being held in bondage. So I blame him for a lot of the rhetoric that was coming out of the Confederate side, and not Robert E. Lee.
Well, Lee freed all of his slaves before he went to battle, because his allegiance was really to the state of Virginia, probably his close friends, everything else, because he even tried to dissuade the Virginia from leaving the United States. And there are others that had the same sentiment, which is why they argued and called it states' rights that they were trying to fight for. They never tried to put the state right that they were fighting for most in the front page. But to be clear, those prejudices were real, they existed, but they go back to exposure. And then that was the sinister part of American slavery, is that we turned it from being socioeconomic into an absence or degradation of humanity. And we spent those hundreds of years trying to create this idea that there was supremacy and inferiority, both externally and internally, to those who are slaves or born other than. I mean, the notion still exists within our society, within our people. That's why, quote unquote, he's light skinned, he is dark skinned, he's a house X, he would have been a field X. We do it to ourselves because that's what has happened. But to be a student of history is to look at causality and figure out the pathway forward. And I think great open conversations get us there, but we have to always be very careful as best as possible to minimize both groupthink and grouping of thinkers, because they in this case, the body of what we call founding fathers, they were at odds and at a lot of the thoughts that existed, but the central ideas are the supremacy of individual rights, the idea that all men really are created equal, and I believe with all my heart that specific passage, based upon the arguments that they had, even the decision that Jefferson almost caused the idea or the vote for us to go to war as a nation, he had to be convinced by John Adams and Franklin to let it go, because South Carolina stood at the precipice under Rutledge to say, we will, if he doesn't strike some of his other language, because he was actually trying to attack slavery. If he didn't do it, if he didn't amend it, the original writings, so that it was to a place where South Carolina would accept it, you'd have lost South Carolina and North Carolina, because South Carolina was following North Carolina's lead. Because remember, the decision to rebel, to become a new nation, was all in. No question, not all in. No exceptions, because New York did not vote to go. New York abstained. So it was actually a 12-1 with an abstention of New York to become a United States. So anyhow, I apologize.
No, I'm very grateful. Very grateful. Maybe,
Okay.
Calvin, any concluding comments from your side?
Well, I mean, I think we've had a great discussion, but my question right now is, I thought we were going to talk about the panel on the 19th. How have we selected everybody? How is it going to work? Do you have an IT administrator who's going to run the Zoom program? What time is the Zoom program? So I still got some questions about Monday night.
Yeah, so Andrew and I, we are in touch with a number of organizations in town, including the Robbins House. We're needing to get some information from them. Hopefully we'll have that clarified tomorrow, Calvin. And we'll be glad to call you and let you know. And Arnold, I don't know what Andrew's communicated to you, but if you are free and would like to chime in, to bring your perspectives, be it on Zoom or whatever, that you're most welcome.
Okay. I appreciate it. And for everybody on the net, my phone number is 757-660-6157. And I'll be more than happy to have any of the follow-up to this discussion that you want to. And I'll support, And we're talking about Monday, the
19th.
The 19th. Yes. Okay. And we're going to go what time?
7 p.m. Eastern time.
Okay. It's on my calendar, so that's a good thing. And I will do whatever you all like me to do. And if you all, if there's a specific issue that you want me to make sure I frame and talk to, I'll do that as well.
Arnold, thank you. Can you give me your phone number once again, if you would?
757-660-6157.
Hello, floor, please.
757-660-6157.
Great, great.
So, are you planning to Zoom the entire program and the panel discussion after the preliminary program?
That's my intent if we get the approval of the venue where it'll be hosted, but my intent is to live stream everything, yes.
Okay.
And we will, Calvin, have more information tomorrow. Have you, Andrew, has anybody from Robin's house gotten back to you yet?
No.
Okay, so we need to follow up there. So we'll communicate one way or another with you tomorrow, Calvin, and Arnold will keep you in the loop. I thank you both very, very much.
All right, thanks
Thank
everyone.
you.
We really appreciate this time, and we look forward to working and networking with you again. So again, this is Center for American Studies at Concord. This is another conversation with Andrew Williams, Jr. Please have a fantastic evening, and we thank all of you for joining us. We really do appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.